I made a video on hard books before, and I've had this lingering feeling like I could have done quite a bit more. I do think it's important to recommend and to read hard books sometimes. They're a great active kind of stretching of the mind, much like you would need to stretch the body in order to have the flexibility to move. You must flex your mind in order to have the flexibility to think in unusual circumstances. Tough books have value in that way of just becoming a practice of the mind, a way of actually devoting yourself to something. Recently, the booktuber Bren Booth Jones did his own attempt at the same topic of 10 hard books, and it reminded me of some of the lack in my own initial attempt at this, in that I showcase quite a few books, but there are certain authors or types of writing that I kind of glossed over or didn't even mention in the slightest. And it feels to me like a real loss to not have a wider range of recommendations, or at least recommendations that are perhaps less obvious. Hopefully, this can bring your attention to some truly great works that are also challenging. And the challenge is what actually elevates the quality of the experience rather than diminishing it or worsening it. So these are going to be 10 hard books that I look forward to reading, but you don't have to. There's no pressure to like these kinds of books. It's really just an invitation to consider pushing your reading outside of your comfort just a bit more. With the first book, the challenge is truly one of attention. Miss Mackintosh, My Darling, by Margaret Young. Now, this is a book I actually became aware of because of the great booktuber Grim Reader. And this author, across 1,300 pages, describes a bus ride with her and just a couple other passengers. In the span of this lengthy bus ride, she muses on memory and goes back in time through her various experiences with close figures in her life and the pivotal shift that interpersonal relationships can have on a person. And it's this constant cascade of memory and detail and really minutia in the book that is so much of the difficulty, but that's also precisely the poetry of the writing. Margaret Young was herself a poet prior to writing this book, and this book took 18 years of her life in order to complete. And it has this feeling of a poet wanting to capture the deep focus and attention of poetry writing, of looking at the world and taking it in fresh, and then inviting the reader in to see it fresh as well. And it makes it so that even though it is across essentially a very short period of time, that period of time is extended so much by the interlocking layers of one's memory. This book seems to me almost a test of what so much literature seemingly aims for, which is to invite you into a completely different perspective. And this one elongates that perspective within a slim period of time. And it's a test of your willingness to fully be encompassed by the mind of another, and how much comfort you can allow within that cocoon of another mind. There are quite a few books that do this, that take a small period of time and then elongate it across a book. There's The Mezzanine, wherein you have a character going down an escalator, and the whole book is just his experience going down that escalator, and then all of the details that then fractally expand and zoom in, and the ways in which what he fixates on becomes so revealing about who he is and aspects of his experiences and the world. And then, of course, there's the iconic example of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, in which the protagonist is seeking to throw a party, but the stream of consciousness narrative is really zooming in and out of all the lives in London at the time, and the constant interplay between lives, effects, cause and effects that are playing off of one another, such that this party becomes almost a culmination of many multivariate universes that persist all around us, and how those universes orbit one another in significant ways, often in ways that we can forget or take for granted. And then you have Anniversaries by Ooh Johnson, which attempts to chronicle a year in the life of a single mother, as newspaper headlines themselves chronicle the conflagration of political turmoil in New York, the rest of America, and in the world, at the same time as the daily experiences of a single person in New York City, this mother. It's this calendar like, day by day, non diaristic, but rather free associative and distant narrative description of her life that makes you appreciate the day to day significance of otherwise punctuated moments. As well, there is the book Life, a User's Manual by Georges Perec, which gives a single moment in time, but zoomed in across an entire apartment building, so that all of the lives literally interlock in terms of the central question at the edge of the story, which is what is indicated by everyone's actions and prospects in that one moment in time, and what can be revealed by a single moment in time. There are so many texts that seem to remind us that time itself is one aspect of our perception, and that aspect in itself can be distended in such a way that it can make even a second feel like an eternity. And Miss Mackintosh, My Darling, is a practice in that focusing in on the world and in some ways appreciating the world, appreciating your own inner life in contrast to the outer external stimulus of day-to-day living. So that's the challenge of the first book, Miss Mackintosh, My Darling. The next book is difficult for its evolution in experimentation with language, and that is the Christine Brooke Rose Omnibus, which is actually a collection of 4 of her books, Out, Such, Between, and Through. What is fascinating about the anthologizing of her works is Christine Brooke Rose was someone who always was striving to experiment with plot structure and how to characterize and how to toy with language in a rebellious manner, and what effect that toying accomplishes on the reader. And with this omnibus, you get a direct evolution of how she's shifting in her writing style. Without and Such, it seems so casually experimental. It's just little nods at fourth wall breaking elements. It sort of is reminding you that it's a book, but still flowing like what you would expect from a book. But then with Between and Through, she starts to really challenge the expectations that you have about how a book should be presented and really how inviting a narrative should be. By the last book, it starts to feel almost Finnegan's Way-like in terms of its utter destruction of the hand-holding that is otherwise so accommodating in most literature. And Christine Brooke Rose seems to demand that you slow down and process line by line and make connections yourself in order to actually move forward within the storyline. And it's that being forced to slow down that perhaps teaches a lesson about how to slow down and how to appreciate the significance of that slowness. I also happen to have another book by her, Zorander and Verbivore, and this is more her attempt at the science fiction genre. But in that attempt, she's using the fact of science fiction's engagement with technology to use programming language and how different the logic of that language can be from the otherwise conventional forms of our speech. And it's really seemingly all about that relationship between self and machine, AI, which is obviously so topical nowadays as we seem to have a simulated AI, not quite a general AI, not even near a general AI as far as I can tell. But it's still something topical in that it just is a fiction writer's struggle through the implications of that kind of language shifting. And that is Zorander and Verbivore, also by Christine Brooke Rose. She's one of those experimental writers that I don't hear about as often, and yet she does so much of what the more well-known experimental writers like James Joyce or Samuel Beckett or John Barth or David Foster Wallace or Thomas Pynchon do. And yet she does it with, I think, a degree more playfulness that I find endearing and satisfying in a different sort of way. Even though it can be very difficult to read some of her works, it also feels like she's an expert at her craft, not quite inviting you in, but at least opening the door. And what you see through the door is so hectic and vibrant in comparison to everything outside of it that perhaps the temptation is enough for you to actually make your way in and make your way through this strange set of hallways of literary device and nuance and novelty. So that is the works of Christine Brooke Rose. All of her works have that difficult experimental quality, and she's seemingly become lost in time, but I hope you give her another chance. The next book is difficult by needing to learn a topic that, at least for many Americans, is less familiar, and that is the history and struggles of the Balkans region, or in this particular case, the former state of Yugoslavia. And that is represented in the book Black Lamb and Gray Falcon, which is a journalistic traveling memoir through Yugoslavia as it is in the midst of political upheaval prior to World War II. And in that traveling, the author is aware that many of the Western readers reading this book will not fully grasp the significance of so many different political ideologies and disagreements at that time. And yet she's using her own wading through this subject to become a way for you to wade along with her and learn to swim through the waters of turbulence amidst a part of the world that could be sometimes often ignored. The bits that I've read of this book, just the little teaser that I've given myself of her writing, suggests a writer who has an extraordinary gift at making you feel there with her, and it feels so honest, so many of her impressions. It doesn't feel as stilted and public facing as you might expect from some journalist writers, where it can feel sometimes like the aim is to strike an applause. She seems to have a voice that is distinctively resistant to merely following norms. She seems to have a kind of brisk, striking honesty to her prose style, and that in the midst of entering a space that so many are unfamiliar with, it can feel like you're there with someone you can trust. It's such a thick book, and it's one of those books that I don't know that I would have given it as much of a chance if not for the booktuber Steve Donahue, who spoke its praises many videos back. It's something that I'm now excited to read. It feels like a big, grand work that again could become forgotten in time because the subject matter feels so foreign and distant to so many in America, at least. That doesn't make it any less significant to all those living in that space and being described. It feels nice, and once you begin, often necessary, to just have a book that has that anthropological perspective of appreciating the differences among cultures and some of the ethnic boundaries and confusions that can arise in a tight space that is often disputed and struggling against the resource gathering of nations surrounding. And that can feel like a reminder of perhaps your own place in the world and the ways in which, had things been otherwise, you could have grown up in a much more challenging time in a much more challenging place. So I look forward to reading Black Lamb and Gray Falcon. I think the prose style is not what's difficult in this case. I think it's really opening yourself up to learning about a part of the world that, in this case, Yugoslavia, is no longer even around. And it's just allowing yourself to wonder about something that's not going to have practical significance in terms of your ability to have a conversation about the subject, but perhaps it can have salience just in your understanding of a culture unlike your own and a time far distant from now. And that is Black Lamb and Gray Falcon by Rebecca West. The next book is also very much about gathering yourself and traveling into a culture and world and time completely unlike your own. And that is the classic Japanese work, The Tale of Genji. Now, of course, you've probably heard of this book. It's seemingly, potentially, among the very first novels ever done, although there's disputation around what counts as a novel from different perspectives. But this one was a book that I know that I've had to read Steve Donahue recommends it so much that I feel like, well, darn it, I better get around to it. But I hesitated for a long time because I wasn't sure about the translation. There are quite a few different translators who have different visions of what matters. I started to order the different translations from the library. It was something I recommend you do for all sorts of translated works if you want to test out the different types of translations to see what fits your taste. And I found that the most recent translation by Dennis Washburn is the most inviting of all. It actually incorporates so much of the context of the story into the prose itself, such that you don't need to rely as much on footnotes or endnotes or lists of characters at the start of the chapter. For that reason, I think the Dennis Washburn will be the translation that I start with when it comes to the Tale of Genji. And for those who don't know, the Tale of Genji is an imperial court storyline that follows this prince character, Genji, who falls in love again and again and again, and also begins to grow over time. And from what I understand, it even goes beyond his lifetime. And it's a big, great work about the courtly intrigues and intimacy and romances of youth into old age. It seems to be a story that aims for grandness above all. And from what I understand, it is one of the great novels. So I really look forward to reading this potentially first novel, The Tale of Genji. The next book is one I've already started reading. I'm actually reading it on my Kindle. I originally bought the physical copy of the book Duck's Newburyport, but I found the bulkiness of it to not lend to the kind of reading experience that seemed to be on offer in that work. It felt too cumbersome to actually have to slowly flip through the pages, and the fact of the physicality of actually having the pages became a distraction from the continuous flow that the narrative is written in. For those who don't know, Duck's Newburyport by Lucy Ellmann follows the interior thoughts of a mother who is worrying about all of the various chores and expectations that surround her. And amidst that worrying is the persistent influx of information and additional worries far removed from daily life. The ways that through news feeds and social media posts and television, we are constantly being inundated by attention grabbers, and each of them communicates themselves as equally significant, even though, of course, they are all so very distant from our actual lives. But because of that constant insistence for our attention, those grand universal problems, they start to feel necessary to think about, always, a constant distraction that's now a part of your life. And so Lucy Ellmann seems to be capturing this feeling of attention scattered again and again in this work. I've been finding the experience especially conducive to reading on Kindle because when I lie in bed and just go through page after page, it feels very much like the kind of narrative device that this book is structured around, of thought after thought of information, and you don't know when the information is going to end. It's that extensive, infinite quality that a Kindle invites, where you don't know how close you are to the end of the book, that elevates the format of the style of writing in this book, that style of fully disruptive and ongoing thinking that pervades all of our lives, that makes so much of our living incapable of being appreciated in the present moment, and so much about all the alternatives of stressors that we could otherwise fixate on. This book, it has this strange elongation to it that is so different than many other kinds of texts. I initially thought it would just be one long sentence, because that's how it certainly seems at the beginning. But then there are disruptions, these little moments of this storyline of a mother and her cubs that is this odd bookmark between the free flow of the prose generally. And it's those interruptions that keeps me curious about what is the broader theme here? What is the broader gestalt attempting to be built up by all of these various interconnected threads? For that reason, though as a book it feels almost plotless, it's that plotlessness that also invites you to fill in for yourself. What are the pieces of the plot that you're given? There is some movement. The main character does actually leave the kitchen and do other things. I've read so far she gets stuck somewhere in the cold and she wonders if anyone's going to help her. And there's sort of this elongated stretch where she's just sitting in her car wondering about the help that she'll get. But then she's also still being inundated by these internal struggles. And it feels almost like the inundation of thoughts about other things, about news-related and worldly things, is a perpetual distraction from what she really maybe wants to think about, such as the loss of her mother and her experience with cancer in the past. And it's these little hints of what's on the margins of her thinking that suggest something so true about all of our thinking, the ways that we can distract ourselves with attention. And what are we distracting ourselves from becomes the central question. So that is Duck's Newbery Report. It's one of the tougher books to read here in the sense that it really is going to feel like you're not moving forward for quite a long time. But I think in that case, it just becomes a matter of recognizing the significance of one's inner confusion and perhaps seeing your own confusion in the protagonists. I was reading some of the poetry in the Norton Anthology of Modern and Contemporary Poetry, and I came across the author Gertrude Stein, who is an author I had heard of many different times in my life, but I hadn't actually read her works directly. And I found it so difficult to connect with her writing style, but it's that difficulty to connect that became all the more intriguing to me. She wrote a book called The Making of Americans, which continues this experimental style that she employs in her poetry. And that is a style of repetition, where repeating the sounds again and again of words in the ways that sometimes repeating the same word can drown out the meaning and cause it to become merely noise. It is that percussion of sound again and again that really becomes a drumbeat of tone rather than meaning, and a rhythm of association rather than strict communication. I'm curious to see if I can handle that plotless, deviating, repetitive sounding of language on the page. And if I can glean some of the significance of that, I want to give it a chance. It's so odd to me and so uninviting that it actually makes me all the more curious to feel my way through it. Because Gertrude Stein clearly struggled her way through the language, and there's obviously this feeling when it comes to a lot of experimental art where it just feels so arbitrary and so messy, like it's pulling a wool over your eyes and just tricking you. But I don't want to be a cynic about these kinds of things. And that particular book is one that, although I don't own it yet, it remains on my wish list as a strange curiosity of what prose writing can be and the ways that as we experiment with language, we maybe can tease out some of the ways out of the constraints of our language, or at least the constraints of our framing of meaning. Gertrude Stein seems to actively be using the anarchy of sound in words to upend our comfort. And I like being in a place of discomfort when it comes to writing. And that's why I recommend also checking out The Making of Americans. When I was in college, I was assigned a book, Women as Lovers. And what was so strange about that book is her total breaking of convention, especially syntax in terms of the paragraph breaks. It looks almost like a big wall of text going through the lives of these figures who are struggling with the expectations of themselves as women as lovers. And in that cascade of expectations also comes a great deal of tragedy in terms of one only getting one lifetime to live, and yet their lifetime is thrust within the constraints of society. This author has a book that was recently reissued, and it is called The Children of the Dead. And that book seems to focus on the costs of World War II and the Holocaust and all the ghosts of those who had suffered during that time, and the ways that the land that we walk upon contains a long chain of history of suffering and loss, in much the same way that she blends the internal and external expectations of her married characters in Women as Lovers. It seems like in this other book, she weds the long gone with the now present in the sense of eternally present suffering, doled out on a culture on the basis of their history. I'm excited to see how she's always feeling her way through the text. She's allowing the emotion to become so constructive in how to write her broader stories. And that was the big feeling I had with Women as Lovers, was of an author following her intuition through and through and through. And with her bigger book, which I don't yet own, but it seems like a challenging work that strives to force us to face the harsher elements of our history. And I find that kind of challenge compelling on its own. And with the writing style that she employs, this kind of mix of beauty with suffering, I could see myself really loving this particularly difficult work, The Children of the Dead, by Elfriede Jelinek. Also, while reading the Norton Anthology of Modern and Contemporary Poetry, I came across the poet Laura Riding, who seemed to have been actively resisting so much of the ways that language can make us complacent to meaning by granting us this sense of solidity, where in fact there's quite a bit of vagueness beneath within the definitions. And she has this moral drive to strive for truth, and she seemingly feels deeply that poetry is the means to gain that truth. And yet she also seems to recognize the obfuscation of metaphor and language to the point that she becomes frustrated by the limits of poetry's ability to actually have us engage with the world. It's that kind of focus on the abstraction in language, that philosophical struggle that she seems to be toiling within, that makes the poems I've read by Laura Riding seem so singular in their genuine pursuit of not lying to you through the eloquence of diction. And that is such an important aspect of poetry, to recognize how much rhetorical meandering poetry can offer. And in the case of Laura Riding, she seems to grasp that rhetorical scaffolding while also wishing to kick it out from under us and have us strike hard the ground of what's actually there beyond the words. There is a collection of her poems and essays, and I think because of how abstracted out her poetry is, it seems worthwhile to me to actually invest the time to understand her perspective on this kind of illusory quality of language. And so I want to check out more of the works of Laura Riding. In thinking of the ways that language can perhaps map out the world but subtract out so much of what is beneath the modeling of that world, there are a couple of writers, Lorraine Distend and Peter Gallison, who work together on a book called Objectivity, which focuses on the mapping that the scientific method relies upon. The ways that in order for science to work, we must create models of prediction, and there are choices behind those various models. And then we also need to create means of representing the things that we experiment upon. And the aspect of representing something can make it feel as if we are directly taking in the facts of that thing, which can sometimes feel like an overconfidence in our choices of modeling. In this book, these authors go through the history of that notion of objectivity, of placing the world down onto the page, and the ways that once it's concrete on the page, it feels known. But of course, there's so much beyond what's merely known in the representation of it. It is that struggle with representation versus reality, with confidence and allowing room for more questioning rather than certainty, that makes a book like Objectivity so compelling. And it's also the kind of book, much like something like Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton, it's this kind of obsessive text of really getting down into the history of the scientific method, not to knock it over in some way. It's obviously one of the best methods that we have for grasping the world in a useful manner, but it doesn't change the fact that there are still human choices involved, and it is interesting to just take in that history in order to try as best you can to understand what those choices were and why they were made. That is Objectivity by Lorraine Distend and Peter Gallison. I have been delving into for a while the different broader meta-ethical theories on offer, such as moral realism and moral anti-realism, and all of the various ethical systems that are pushed forward and argued by various philosophers. And there's one such philosopher that stands out as having a particularly unusual stance, although it's actually a stance that calls back to Aristotelian ethics, and that is G.E.M. Anscombe. And Elizabeth Anscombe is a philosopher who I've heard of many times, but have not actually read her works. And she has numerous philosophy works that seem to contend with the issue of what is this notion of moral duty or obligation, the normative quality of ethics, where by giving you a rule, it implies a kind of should to it, this feeling of needing to follow through on something. And from what I understand, Elizabeth Anscombe takes on the position that the very idea of needing rules in morality is a kind of holdover of religious belief, of this view of a God on high giving you instructions to follow. And rather, from her perspective, there seems to be a priority toward character rather than rule following, a return to Aristotelian virtue ethics, where it's about aiming for that golden mean within one's character in order to live the best life for oneself in relation to the myriad others that interplay with that self, as opposed to just having a kind of rigid system for all, a normative system that must apply across the board. And it is a strange philosophy. It's one that is counterintuitive to my own intuitions, but that makes it all the more fascinating to actually dive into. And I think with a lot of ethical philosophy, it can sometimes get so down into the weeds that it can feel as if you're getting lost. But I think that's also the value of, again, stretching your way of thinking and allowing yourself to be uncomfortable with some of the conclusions being reached by philosophical arguments. The works of G.E.M. Anscombe, I think, are ones that perhaps can challenge all of us to think differently about the assumptions that we have about moral rules generally. She is a philosopher who actually coined the term consequentialism in the process of attempting to critique it, to critique the notion of relying on consequences in order to determine some kind of set oughts that everyone else must adhere to. And she seems to be attempting to challenge the notion of ought when it comes to doing anything, or at least the notion that it is necessary to follow such shoulds and oughts. I want to have my moral intuitions challenged in that way, so I look forward to reading that kind of work. And so that's why that would be the last difficult book that I would recommend for this list, is a philosophy work that is actively against so much of the basic assumptions that we have in modern moral philosophy. And I think that could be worthwhile just in and of itself, merely to test your own thinking. And perhaps you can come away at the end of reading all of her works feeling like you haven't changed your mind in the slightest. But that's okay, because I'm sure you had to figure out your thinking quite a bit in the process of determining that you disagree with this author. So those are my list of 10 more hard books that I'm excited to read, but you don't have to read them. And I hope it's just an inviting way to think more about books that are difficult in different kinds of ways, that require you to exercise your thinking steps further than you're used to. And maybe that is the worth, that process of exercising that habit of reading, that is itself worthwhile on its own. That is my list. I will put the names of all of the works that I mentioned into the description below. Be sure to check that out, and thank you for watching.